Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of Avid Ideology. The contours of global prosperity and influence are in constant flux. We are living in an era of super diversity where the expansion of markets and exchange of technology have not only brought in enormous opportunities but have also posed complex economic and sustainability challenges. The changing nature of power today, where the culture power and the network power are becoming increasingly significant, it is now time for us to rethink our policies, practices and notions of personal and collective identity. Inspired by Mastech's CEO Sudhakar Ram's book, The Connected Age, our talk today will look at the new narratives of the connected world and will try to build a footprint that is ideal for more integrated community, where ideas and cultures bridge new boundaries. Joining us are outstanding group of thinkers and scholars that have come together to reframe our thoughts and ideas to create more inclusive world. Recipient of CNBC Asia's Indian Business Leader of the Year Award, our speaker tonight, Sudhakar Ram, has set new paradigms in human and organizational behavior through his very popular blog, The New Constructs, and his book, The Connected Age. He is the co-founder and the CEO of Mastech, a multinational IT services company headquartered in Mumbai and has major presence in UK, US, Canada, and Asia Pacific. A strong believer of change, our second speaker, Royston, promotes microfinance as a sustainable tool to eradicate poverty. Royston Braganza joined Grameen Capital in 2007 to launch the organization as CEO. Grameen Capital, founded by the Foundation USA, IFMR Trust, and the Citigroup, is first of its kind social businesses that enables microfinance institutions develop wider access to capital markets. He is also served on many boards and advisory bodies, including Sadhan, Grameen Foundation India, FICCI, and United Nations Microfinance Resource Group. Our moderator for the evening, Rajni Bakshi, is a Gandhi Peace Fellow at Gateway House and Mumbai-based author. She has published a research paper in October 2012 titled Civilizational India. Her other books include The Bazaars, Conversation and Freedom, Bapu Kuti, Long Haul, Warning and Opportunity, and many more. She is also a member of Executive Community and Gandhi Smriti and Darshan Samiti. Avid Ideology is curated not just as a passive panel discussion, but rather where audiences actively engage and share their inputs and co-create new visions. Thus, we actively support open-ended questions and views and ideas during the course of discussions.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thanks very much to Avid, firstly, for coming up with such a wonderful idea. I think in a time when many of us, in fact the world as large is tired of ideology, I think this coinage is just wonderful. And very much, I think, responding to, it's going to tug at a lot of heartstrings. At a time when we have an amazing combination of great optimism, because the upsurge of aspirations, and I don't mean just material aspirations, but across the world you are seeing a rise of societies and individuals, collectives, and various kinds of formations where people are looking for a better way of living that means better in terms of greater dignity to all. Not just that everybody must, of course, have roti, kapda, makan, but that people want this with a greater sense of dignity. And so that is the exciting paradox of our times, that on the one hand we have this rise of assertion in favor of greater dignity, and at the same time we have a world riddled with so many crises. The market system as we have known it for 200 years is pretty much in crisis of one kind and another, and I don't just mean the meltdown of 2009. We'll talk about that a little more as we go along. So in that context, I think the framing of an ideology is wonderful. So thanks to Avid for that, and thanks for inviting all of us here. We are going to begin with a short presentation by Sudhakar Ram about his book, in fact, and the work that he has done, which much predates the book. And in that sense, the book is not just ideas pulled out of the air. It is born out of a net-based conversation, which actually I think began around the same time that my book on Bazaars and Conversations came out. And that conversation involved a wide range of people, many of them running their own businesses, but some from the non-profit sector. And that has led to the book, Connected Age. And then we'll have a brief presentation by Royston, and then a question and answer, and everybody gets to come in at some point. So please keep your questions ready. It will be a conversation, and this is not an evening for monologues. And over to Sudhakar.
Thank you, Rajni. I've got a brief presentation that I thought I'll take you guys through. So essentially, as I wrote the book and as I talk about it, it looks like we do need a new narrative, that the 19th and 20th century had a very strong narrative based on what we all know as industrialization, the centralization, mass production scale. But the 21st century needs a new kind of narrative, and that's what I think the book, and that's actually more a post facto description rather than what I intended to start doing when I started writing the book. So what I want to take you through is what made me write this book. That actually, like Rajni rightly says, it's around the 2009 time frame that this thought came. And this thought came not just because I had some brainwave, but all the situations around, both from a macroeconomic perspective, social perspective, political perspective, seem to be breaking down. And I kept reflecting on it, saying, is there something fundamentally that is going wrong, or is this the way it is, and we keep trying to fix a symptom rather than going and changing something fundamental? So I don't want to take you through all the things, but 2009 was the meltdown. Lehman Brothers went down. Around that 2009-10 time frame, we started having uprisings in the Middle East, Arab Springs, Egypt, other parts of Middle East. Occupy Wall Street movement happened probably around 2011 or so. We all knew, based on the Nobel Prize for Al Gore, that there was substantial ecological damage. So that was coming to forefront, but it was something which was distant, not something one could actually engage with in any reasonable way. Around the same time, Mastek, the company that I run, was also going through trouble. After having successfully grown at 25% plus the previous 5 years, suddenly we were declining. And we were declining because of the meltdown, and the nature of work that we did involved banks and insurance companies and so on. And personally, I was having challenges saying, okay, I've run this company, I've been part of the founding team for 25 years. Should I really be doing this, or should I start looking at something else? All this came together at the same time, and that led to a level of churn within me. The first thing I thought was, maybe I have some ideas, let me go and start writing a book. And I met a friend of a friend, a guy called Anand Raman in Harvard Business Review and Harvard Publishing. He says, no, I mean, you don't have enough content to write a book. The best thing in today's world is to start a blog. And before that, even though I was a technical person, I've never thought of writing a blog. I said, who's going to keep writing and who's going to read my blog? Because I can keep raving and ranting about anything, but what actually does it serve? But that was the best advice I've ever had, and I started this blog called The New Constructs, where what I was trying to figure out is that these issues are there, but are there some kind of glimpses of solutions? Are there people, are there institutions, are there organizations who are trying to live a different life? And that was the whole context of The New Construct. So at a personal level during this period, the change that I mean, as a CEO, it's very natural that you feel like an atlas. You have an atlas complex and you think the entire organization depends on you. I found that the way I was being was actually disempowering the teams around me, my own teams, to do their best. And this is not easy to get off. As a CEO, to say that, okay, I'm going to remove the organization's burden off my back and share it freely was not easy. And the paradigm that I've been brought up on, right, since my childhood is that independence is king. That somehow you have to be independent. So I saw my own team as, I don't want to be dependent on my team. So that mindset had to change, saying it's not about independence, that the world is about interdependence, that how do I work with my team? And I started looking at what does this translate to from the way we live our world, because everything is about greed, it's about self-interest, it's about promoting independence. That's the paradigm of the industrial age. while the new age seems to call for something else, that what worked there is not going to work in future. Through all this period, the fact that I had a teenage daughter who was about 15, 16 at that time, and I was looking at what is she going to do in life. So is this the kind of world that she's going to succeed in? All those came together in terms of the insights that I created. And basic thought was we need to move away from a independent success, money being the only measure of success, scale, mass growth as the only mantra, to move away from that into a more connected age which is softer, more feminine in some way, more interdependent, and more about the higher self. That it's not all about me, me, me. It's not about material success. Can I be more about the world in general, about my own community? So I started doing that in the blogs, and over a period of time, I don't know why, but a whole lot of youngsters started reading the blogs, contributing to it, liking some stuff, not liking some stuff, and so on. So that gave me the feedback and the momentum to keep continuing. So this is something that I still continue doing even after the book came. And just the one which is going to come on Monday is my 250th blog on this topic. So in essence, the entire shift is from, this is what I see in the connected age, that it's a shift from independence to interdependence. And interdependence is a very different framework. It's quite anathema to someone who's self-made, who's trying to make it, to say, okay, I'm no longer independent, I can't have answers to all my problems, and I need to actually work with a team to make it happen. And it's different from dependence. So interdependence is a very different kind of a paradigm. We have to move from mindless consumption, that today, consume, consume, consume. After 9/11, the first call is go and shop. That cannot sustain, because we are consuming 1.5 planets every year. That cannot be the paradigm for our life. So how does the world move from a focus on consumption to actually looking at things which are beyond material consumption, which is more fulfilling, more green, more holistic in some form? Is money the only measure of success? Money is a beautiful, very seductive measure, because you can put multiple things and create a lowest common denominator out of money. So whether it's personal wealth, it's market capitalization, GDP growth, everything comes, money becomes a great measure. And so it's almost as if human beings have no other facet except money. That the only thing you have is a material aspiration. There's nothing emotional, nothing intellectual, nothing spiritual. So it masks every other attribute, because we all think, okay, that's the soft stuff. Now let me come to the hard stuff, which is money. Which is, I mean, in corporate lingo, it's all about growth, it's all about profitability. So how do we move beyond that? Our entire process of education, Alvin Toffler talks about it in the third wave, saying education was actually geared towards industrial age, towards creating assembly line workers, burger flippers, and so on. And it had three overt purposes and three covert purposes. Overt purpose was to teach us reading, writing, arithmetic, that you are educated, you're literate, you know your sums, you can take care of yourself in life. The covert purpose was actually we were moving the population from an agrarian mindset to an industrial mindset. So you wanted to teach them discipline, punctuality, saying, okay, if I say the school starts at 8, ensure that you come at 8, go off at 4. That was one main role of schooling as a way of socializing people. The second was to obey your seniors, obey your teachers, because you wanted factory workers not to be in control of their own lives, you wanted them to work under supervision. And the third was get used to mind-numbing dumb stuff that you have to do day in and day out, so that an assembly line job looks very good at the end of it. So that was the covered process of education. And is that education going to work for us, for our children and grandchildren in the 21st century? We have teachers who have learned something over the last 30, 40 years, teaching kids today some outdated content, when we know everything changes every 5 years, and the way world works changes every 5 years today. So are we really equipping our children for the 21st century? So that's something that we explore in the book. So can corporations today have they're maligned. Today, if you see Gallup surveys, corporation and US Congress have similar levels of confidence among the US public, and it's under 20%. It's in the 15, 16, 17, depending on the quarter. Is that really what we want? That all of us are spending so much time, effort as business leaders. Do we want to be in a thing which is rated so poorly, which has so little confidence, so little trust among the consumers, among the citizens in some way? Or could corporations become more soulful, more powerful, more conscious institutions in some way? Again, industrial age saw the benefits of centralization. And Gandhi always used to say that any form of centralization is corruption. That when you institutionalize something, corruption not necessarily in the thing of, okay, people making money. The core purpose is lost in some way when you institutionalize things. So governments today are largely institutional, and more power is being centralized. And we know that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So is this the paradigm, or should we have more human-sized governments, more locality level, village level governments which people can actually engage with in some form? So these are some of the things that we explore in the book, and I'm sure with Rajni and Royston as we talk we'll have some insights into the book. But this morning I was just speaking to my daughter who's 19 now, and she's interning in New York. So she said, okay, you're going to go for this talk, what's your goal? I said, I don't have much of a goal, I just want to see if people can be open and read my book. So she accused me of being this is very low goal, you should have something higher. So I said, I'm not about goals. Goals are at one level. I'm really about a vision, saying, can we actually do something meaningful? And people will take their own time. So I can't set targets, I can't set goals in terms of when people will read and what they will do with it. It's just an intent, it's just a stand that I have. And that's what I'd like to share with you this evening. So the entire principles of the book are based on moving away from, we have given away our power to institutions. We have given away our power to governments. How do I regain individual sovereignty? So these are some fundamental principles. How can I work compassionately, coexist with my community? Greed is good, and all media is actually propagating that idea with Fortune 500 lists and wealthiest people and so on. Can we move away from that and say, actually, my expectation is that people are accountable for the well-being of the world, not well-being of themselves, which was Gandhi's idea of freedom, that it was all about responsibility, not entitlement in some form. So these are fundamental principles for the book. And enablers are the whole idea of subsidiarity, that things have to be decided and people have to take charge of their lives at the lowest possible level. So subsidiarity is in line with the whole idea of small is beautiful. So how do I make things smaller in some form? The idea of markets, not in our current form, but the real intent that Adam Smith had, can we recreate that as markets where it's a level playing field? It's not a few large corporations trying to take advantage with a political nexus, but really it's available for people in all spheres of life to operate on a level playing field. And third is that governance actually has to be connected to the level of level playing field you have in the market. That something which you cannot have too much of a level playing field will need more governance. Something can have light touch. A family may have a light touch governance. So keep governance as light as possible. So these are some of the enabling principles that I talk about in the book. So just to give you a very brief glimpse over my journey and what the book contains. So I hand it over to Royston to share his own journey with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sudhakar. Royston, thank you so much. Of course, you will be responding to Sudhakar's book, which you have read. But I was also, the last point that you raised, I think is very crucial. What is the difference between a goal and a purpose? I thought that perhaps if you could dwell on that, because your sector is a very good example, that everybody should have access to finance as a goal. But what is the purpose behind it? What is the larger vision of society that we would say is a society worth having, rather than just a survival game?
Thanks at the outset for inviting me here. And I think the title of Professor Yunus's book comes to mind, which says, Creating a World Without Poverty. And for me, possibly that could be the starting point of this larger purpose from which, microfinance, which is financial inclusion, or micro-housing, which is a shelter for everyone, or affordable education, which is education for all, sort of flow from there. So in some ways, the source and the summit comes a full circle. And sort of speaking to that book, though, a good segue into that, reminds me of, and what I'm going to do is maybe give you a few case studies to show how this is typified in a practical sense, because sometimes it's easy to be cerebral about the social environment and all of these various things, but just on the ground, grassroots level, how does this really work? And I'm reminded of Professor Yunus when he went to Paris to speak at an event and got a note from Frank Ribot, who was the chairman of Danone at that point of time. And Frank wanted to come and meet him. He had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and so Professor, as usual, crazy schedule, but obviously made time for Frank. And when they chatted and talked about the work at Grameen and Danone, and then Frank said, how can I help you? And Professor said, why don't we start Grameen Danone? Off the cuff. Never planned, never discussed, never even thought about. And that's the way he works. So you pick a social problem and then find a business solution. And that's been how Grameen Bank started. And that's the rest of the Grameens started that way as well. So he picked the problem of malnourishment, which was a huge problem in Bangladesh. He said, how do we figure out working with your strengths, which is you're a large yogurt manufacturing company. The Banglas love their Mishti Dohi. How do we bring those two together and create Shakti Dohi, which is what the Grameen Danone product is called. It sells for 6 to 8 takas depending on where you buy it. But it is so highly fortified with enzymes and proteins and everything that a child needs. So even if you have 2 cups of Shakti Dohi in a week, it takes care of all your nutrient requirements for that week. And so Frank immediately said, this is a great idea, got up and shook his hand. And Professor Yunus sat back and said, but I need to tell you that this is a social business. And he said, so what's that? And he said, a social business is a business that is created to solve a social problem, but is not for profit maximization. In fact, there is no return of economic value to the capital that's brought in. So there is a return of capital, but no return on capital. So it's a for-profit, non-dividend distributing entity. And Frank again got up and shook his hand and he said, no, can I explain this to you again? And he went through this process because he wasn't sure that anyone was ready to buy into an ideology of that nature. And even coming out of the luncheon at Gerard Depardieu's restaurant, he wrote back to him the whole principles of social business, and just to make sure that Frank got it. But that's how Grameen Danone started. They're opening their second plant in Chittagong. That's how Grameen Adidas started. So it started with kids and adults who used to have worms residing in their stomach, causing dysentery and a whole lot of infection. And these worms entered through the cracks in the feet of people who would walk in the swampy Bangladeshi lands after the floods without footwear. And so Professor Yunus challenged the Adidas guys who said they wanted to help. So it's a very dangerous thing telling Professor Yunus or anyone in Grameen that you want to help. So Sudhakar, I told you earlier, we need to talk. That's a forewarning now. And so he said, can you make a $1 shoe? And Adidas obviously sort of regretted offering. I'm just sort of putting in a lighter vein. But I was with Professor Yunus in Berlin and we saw the prototype for the $1 shoe. It looks more like a floater, but it serves the purpose to cover the sole of the feet. And that's how Grameen Adidas started. Grameen Veolia started when there was no drinking water available. So he tried up with Veolia, which is the French water company. Grameen Adidas, Grameen BASF, Grameen Danone, Grameen Auto, which is looking at product manufacturing. So a whole lot of these ideas came up with a single premise saying, can we find a business solution to tackle a social problem? Let's move away from an NGO mindset, and there's nothing wrong about NGOs, and so this whole discussion is not judgmental about a certain stream of solution providers, but it's really talking to a point saying, can we bring business minds, people who have the wherewithal, who've run businesses, who understand business, who understand the market, and bring those minds to creating a business solution for a social problem. And immediately he would get asked this question, and often we are, as I run Grameen in India, which is also the first social business here, saying, but can't you give a little return? Because people may not want the 15 or the high teens or the low 20s IRRs, but some return. And we often talk about the spectrum, and you can take whatever return you want, but we want to own the zero return space. Because once you come into that space of no return, you're not focused on how much can I take out of this company, but how much can this company generate so that it can do more good. And so Grameen Capital India was set up as a social business. And when we looked at India, as I was sharing with you just before we spoke, the first thing intuitively was, let's create an MFI. Unfortunately, we got McKinsey, who did a pro bono study for us and said, you know, the last thing that you should do is create another microfinance institution. There are already 800 of them. You're the global pioneer in microfinance. Why do you want to become 801? But create something that benefits the whole sector. And at that time, rough estimates was about a $50 billion demand for this business. Supply was less than $1 billion, so a huge gap for people who are excluded. And if you read Raghuram Rajan's reports or any of these coming out in the media these days, you know that 400 million people have no access to even basic formal financial services. And so this is a huge gap. Capital access was the big point, and they said, you know what, it needs to move away from grant funding, subsidized funding, because you can never build scale at that level. You need to have mainstream capital access. And so we created what we call a social investment bank, an investment banker to the poor on the back of Professor Yunus's Banker to the Poor. And we built over the last 5 years, and I keep joking that, you know, while all my colleagues moved up the corporate ladder, I tend to move down. So I started with Citibank in corporate banking, and then investment banking, and then mid-market, and then set up HSBC's SME business, and then microfinance, and keep going lower. But honestly, I think the fulfillment and the joy is inversely proportional to the levels of the organization or in the hierarchy that one goes to. And we've decided to say, how do we create really a capital with a conscience ecosystem? So my vision is much broader than just saying, how do we create an investment banker to the poor? We've helped to raise about $150 million so far for microfinance and affordable health and affordable education. But now looking at creating a social venture capital fund. So the new SEBI guidelines creates this new animal called the Social Venture Capital Fund, which is part of the architecture now of the fund system, and that's from a note that I wrote for SEBI. And then the other idea was to create a venture debt or a social debt vehicle. I mean, we had to toss up between the two because we have a huge team of 3 people in India. So we had to choose one, and the ego-gratifying option was to be able to do the Social Venture Capital Fund because we've helped write the policy. But the market seemed to say, let's get debt into the system, because there is just no debt. There are social entrepreneurs dying on the vine daily because they cannot scale. And so they do the next most logical thing to do is to get equity from somewhere so that they can scale, which is the silliest thing to do, because they end up diluting before their time. They bring in equity, they end up losing control. They've started with a social objective, they want to scale, but now they've got in a venture capitalist or an angel investor. And again, nothing against that breed, but they have a different mindset. And so they end up taking the company in another direction, so increasing the price points, changing the geography, upping the segment, a whole lot of changes to make it more profitable, whereas possibly the social entrepreneur never wanted that. And so this entire aspect of how do we get debt to be used for debt rather than equity, which is used for working capital, triggered this off in us. And so we've just launched our first social venture debt fund, a debt fund to social enterprises, and then hopefully a social venture capital fund, and then hopefully a social stock exchange, where people sitting in this room can say, I want to do 1,000 rupees, and that's my contribution, and so I can buy shares of another social investor, and possibly on the other side, a crowdfunding platform. So really to create this whole capital with a conscience ecosystem, so that social enterprises and social entrepreneurs really have somewhere to go to, and we're seeing a lot of young people these days who want to look at that space. So I'll stop here, but just to give you practical aspects of how we are seeing this play out in India, and then we can take it forward in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Royston. Thank you very much. This brings us actually to the heart of what I think we are here to do today, which is to look at the space between the reasons for hope and all the positive, creative developments, both of you have spoken about them, and the undertow, the darkness, which is equally strong, because while it is highly commendable what Dannon has done, the future lies in asking whether we can trigger processes of finance and creativity which will enable people at multiple levels. As I think Sudhakar pointed that out very, very precisely. all centralization, forget centralization, any concentration of power, even if it's not centralized, is suspect. And and I'm sure we can talk about that at some point, because the Danone story in Bangladesh has also been critiqued for those very same reasons. That yes, it is important in the short run and wonderful, thank you, that a Danone can participate with a Grameen to get fortified nutritional products to people at a very, very affordable rate. But what is the future? And the example about the footwear also, and we know of many footwear companies actually that are now doing that. There is one in California that gives away a pair for every pair that you buy. But this is still somewhat in the realm of do-gooding. What are some of the structural changes that we want to look for or strive for, which would empower people in a completely dispersed and decentralized way and fulfill the promise of the connected age? Because the paradox is that yes, we are more connected as a species than ever before. See, I think we are agreed that the internet alone is going to change in many ways, maybe even who we are as a species. I mean, if the Gutenberg printing press was a revolution, I think this is 1,000 times over. So the connected age has all these positive possibilities. But at the same time, we also know that there is now great concern about the concentration of power in Google. So how do you both see this? If you could just briefly, both of you, respond to this paradox in a very harsh, realistic sense.
Yeah, so my view of it is it working? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, my view of it is this change is one person at a time. It's not an institutional change, and that's something we are all very averse to, given everything we want to talk about is scale, that so many million people got impacted. This doesn't work that way. This is one person taking up and doing something in his own immediate community, his immediate, even his own family, and that's how this change happens. And this change happens because he feels powerful. So the fundamental principle or expectation I have is that people will stop looking at positional power which comes based on their position in an organization, position in a society, their educational qualification, and really experience the fact that we are really powerful. We don't need any of those frills. Individually, as human beings, we are very powerful. And can I experience that power and live up to my power? So can I operate completely with personal power? I think that's one change, and that's what I would like to see. And some of the things that we do in Mastek are trying to promote that, because you can very easily be at the effect of the corporate, be a cog in a wheel in a large corporation. How do we still get people to step up and say, no, I make a difference? So it's at one level it is that, another level it is actually actively voting against any kind of concentration of power, whether it is commercial, whether it is political, whether it is at a social level. So it's a combination of both those, and we see those movements. In the book I keep pointing to early signals. It's nowhere near mainstream, it's nowhere at a critical mass level, but there's enough signal, whether you take governments, whether you take corporations, whether you take markets, where people are figuring out that this thing doesn't work, that we need a new form of coming together.
But are we close to a tipping point on this?
Very difficult to say. I hope I see it in my lifetime, so yeah.
So, sure. I'm not as patient as Sudhakar. So one person at a time, 6 billion days, assuming one person a day, many lifetimes then would take to be able to revolutionize the world. Having said that, it is a Herculean task. But I do believe that an enabling ecosystem has a great role to play. Because if, and I liked that aspect in your book about positional power and personal power, and it's important that that energizes people and you see greatest change from people who experience personal power. The fact is that if you're not creating enabling ecosystems, then you're just pushing against the wall and you're not building the momentum for the spark to create the forest fire. You can't do one flame at a time and expect to see that in many lifetimes away. So the fact is that if we want to see the writing on the wall,
or writing on the Wall Street or whatever way you want to call it. But if you want to see that and then begin the change now, then you need to have enabling ecosystems, and we're seeing that already. We're seeing young, bright people. As I was sharing with you a little while ago, I have 2 interns, one 17-year-old, one 18-year-old, one's building my crowdfunding platform. I mean, it's amazing to see young people who are so passionate about wanting to make a difference. They've seen it, they're well-moneyed, they've been here, and they know that that's not what's exciting them anymore. So we have bright people in colleges. Professor Yunus keeps encouraging us to meet college students. On Monday, I'm addressing another group of college students. And so we keep seeing people, very young people, ready to take that challenge, take the plunge. They don't mind if they don't get paid for a year. It makes no difference to them if they get $2,000 or not to cover their transport. But they want to see, can they make a difference in the life of someone? So the whole enabling environment is critical. The ecosystem is critical. Can we do that in our schools and colleges? Can we create that in our NGO arms who are providing technical assistance? Can we provide that in the capital arms? So things like what we at Graveen Capital are doing. Can we create social stock exchanges to be able to create the momentum behind this? And so every single cog in the wheel needs to start thinking and talking this language. Again, to agree with Sudhakar, it's a Herculean task, but there has to be some momentum, some impatience, as opposed to the patience and the patient approach that Sudhakar has. I don't know even if they are opposed to each other or complementary.
The ecosystem depends, the nature of the ecosystem depends a lot on what you assume to be the fundamental motivations by which people act. And our view of how selfish or selfless or somewhere in between human beings actually are is central to how the ecosystem takes shape. So the premise, for example, on Wall Street, and I use Wall Street here as a metaphor, not just as a physical place, is that regulated greed is good. Regulated just enough to prevent the kind of chaos that we saw unfold in 2008. Now, how this unfolds, how this sort of cascades to the ground was very well illustrated by the microfinance crisis. When the microfinance industry, since in case there are some people in the audience who may not have followed the microfinance story, the microfinance industry grew by leaps and bounds in India for about 10 years, roughly, before it reached a point where one company actually went public. It listed itself on the stock market because what started out as a purely community-driven, local money circulating, non-profit enterprise had by then become a for-profit enterprise which was attracting capital from across the world, very well-intentioned capital, but it was global capital, and so it needed profit. It was not, in fact, in Professor Yunus's model. And in fact, I know that Professor Yunus and some of our Indian friends lost friendships when the Indian microfinance business went for the aggressive, it looked to some of us aggressive, for-profit model, and it finally did melt down. Which is a long story and we don't need to go into the details. But at that point, one of my friends, Aloysius Fernandez, who has always remained in the non-profit microfinance mode, he said something which I thought was maybe capturing the crux of the matter. He said the enemies of the good have been speed, greed, and replicability. And this goes back actually to my earlier question, that the dominant model has a definition of replicability, which it then imposes on people at every level of the so-called value chain or the human chain. And is that really worth it? Or let me give you another very, I think, telling insight that a friend of mine who had been a philanthropic supporter of microfinance, Rohini Nilekani, said. She said that throughout her experience, and she had been deep inside the sector as a board member of one of the not-for-profit MFIs, she said the crux of our success was a certain social stickiness. And I loved that word, stickiness. So there was much more there than just 10 people holding hands and say, I'll vouch for you, and that's what makes us viable. And that's what makes sure that we pay back 99% of the money that we borrow. That social stickiness had a moral, ethical, community-rooted character, which doesn't come from a purely legal, group of 10 that has to serve as collateral for each other. So the challenge that I would pose to both of you is that in what ways do we have to really confront the idea that everything has to be incentivized? Because if we have accepted that everything needs to be incentivized, then society is over. Then it means that nothing needs to be done for the sake of being done, because it's the right thing to do. And what in that context, is the promise of many of these very good trends? Because I'm afraid a lot of them still look like acts of goodness on the margins, which have no promise in hell of challenging this fundamental darkness that everything needs to be incentivized. Sudhakar, you want to go first?
Yeah, so let me step back a bit, because you've made 3 different points. One is the notion that we have to create an ecosystem so that this thing can be catalyzed. Who's the we? So somehow we all take upon ourselves that we are all gods and we have to create something where the poor people will somehow manage. So that's a notion that we come with. And in our own eyes, in our own generation, we have seen the most significant change happening in the world with no one creating that ecosystem, which is the internet, which completely grew based on individual acts of freedom, but linking to something else. So every time I'm only linking to one other computer, but that way I create a whole net. So any form of, if we think we have to create an ecosystem, we have a God delusion, and with great difficulty I got out of it. So that's one aspect, that do we have to create an ecosystem, or we have seen other forms which have worked, which have and all nature is like that. It proliferates very fast. It's not 1% at a time doesn't mean that every day one person changes. It is every second somebody can change, and he changes somebody else and he changes. So it creates that multiplication effort. And most changes that we have seen which stick are those kind of changes. Things which are forced on us, it's like communism, it forced on us, it doesn't stick. Communism lasted 100 years from start to finish. It's not a long-term sustainable model. So that's one part on the institutionalization. And the second is about greed, that we cannot assume, obviously, that, and nor can we propagate. So the whole idea of an ideal, saying that we have to as society hold ideals for ourselves, is we have to hold ourselves accountable for well-being of the world. Today, nobody even insists that you are responsible for the well-being of the world. We think it's somebody else's problem. As long as you take care of yourself and you don't dirty your situation around you, you're fine. Till we raise the bar on our own moral standards, saying I am accountable for what happens in the world, at least around me. And I'm quite capable of being accountable, and I respect you enough, I hold you powerful enough that I will make you accountable to do. Because freedom and accountability are two sides of the same coin. So can I hold people free enough, powerful enough that they can be accountable? And that has to be the posture that media takes, posture that all of us take, starting with ourselves and with the people we deal with. So I think that's the...
In all fairness, though, I think Royston was not saying that we would single-handedly or collectively create the ecosystem. But for example, what they are doing with the zero-dividend social enterprise concept is I would say it's at least a bucket in the ocean, not a drop. Just to make it easier for you, Royston.
Thanks, Rajan. So I'd like to comment on both the questions that you raised. I think the first was specifically on microfinance. And interestingly, while you did call it a meltdown that we are seeing now, it isn't. In fact, it's a resurgence. And
that's because there's been recovery since the meltdown.
And which is in all walks of life. There is always cyclicity in life. So it's very interesting to see how life tends to fall, to wane, and then again you come into a crest. And if you didn't have that, maybe the next wave would have not been bigger. And so we are seeing, we had 30 million households that were microfinance clients. You're absolutely right that we saw a glut of microfinance institutions enabled by a perverse incentive, coming back to your earlier point on incentive, which is where banks had to meet certain priority sector obligations. They found microfinance as a good way to meet priority sector obligations. So money flowed hand over fist into the microfinance institutions. They needed then to deploy that money. So they started giving larger ticket loans, possibly more than the people could really repay, scale up, and all of those things. You found microfinance institutions going to millions of clients, 8 million, the one you mentioned who went into an IPO. And the whole focus changed. In fact, I have one slide that I would like to show at this stage, which in some ways summarizes my lessons from the microfinance crisis, and especially in a place like Blue Frog, it sort of fits in some ways. Yeah. So for me, that's the slide that summarizes the microfinance crisis. A good time now to ask you for your reactions.
What is the script on top?
What does this tell you? What does this picture tell any of you? Come on, you're in Blue Frog. React. Temptation. What else does it tell you about the person? She got nice legs, right? Shows a bit of leg, that's it. Any men in the house thinking she has nice legs? Okay, I saw a hand up saying she's got nice legs. Seduction, good. So there's a creative audience here. Asa, they're going to stay on and party all night. Sexist, that's true, I heard that. Okay, but interestingly, and the comment came from a couple of tables and a few hands about nice legs. And the reason I chose this picture was exactly that the microfinance sector went through the same illusion. You cannot say she has nice legs if you look at this picture. All you can say is she has one nice leg. And so exactly the same point of microfinance. It has two legs to stand on, a social and a commercial. And everyone saw the commercial leg doing very well. Thank you. Everyone saw the commercial leg doing very well and assumed that the social leg was being taken care of. When I started in this sector 6 years ago, the first question that were asked were how many clients you had. 1 year later, what's your recovery rate? 1 year later, what's your portfolio size? 1 year later, what's your profitability? 1 year later, what's your P book value multiple that you're getting for your investor? 1 year later, what's the IPO listing price? Everyone began to gravitate towards one leg. And I'm not here to say one is more important than the other. But the moment you begin to focus on one leg, you're completely ignoring the other. You have the risk of finding something that's non-sustainable. And so it's important for us, and that's the lesson we learned the hard way in the microfinance sector with the Andhra Pradesh crisis hitting. Again, it was, it's easy to call it a crisis, but in the Andhra Pradesh scenario, your regulator is your competitor. So the Andhra government ran its own Velugu project, which was funded by the World Bank, which had the same set of targets. So there was a multiple set of reasons as to why the crisis hit, and we won't go into that because this is not a microfinance discussion. But today, we are seeing a resurgence of microfinance. Every other state other than Andhra Pradesh still continues to have above 99% repayment rates and growing dramatically. Bandhan has got its first banking license, pretty much ahead of names who are of top quality names in the sector. So we have been able to create a momentum, a wave, which is institutionalized something that was written off. That lending to the poor who cannot provide collateral, who cannot provide any forms of bankability should never be done. They should only be used to take savings products because they put their money under their mattresses. And so let's give them a formula. And so today payment banks and small banks are still following a very micro mindset about it. So I just want to say that it's important for us to be able to challenge paradigms, and I like Sudhakar's book for that, and say how do we set up really this great forest fire.
Thank you. I think we can can take some questions from the audience now. Is there a floating mic? Yeah? Anybody? Yeah, there's one there.
And in all this, what is the role of the
Can you
government?
identify yourself,
Oh,
please?
this is Manjeet Kripalani from Gateway House. I'm a colleague of Rajni's. What is the role of the government in all this? Because as we're going to see this government, if we're going to look forward, this government is going to play a large role. And it's going to play a role in trying to fix things rather than trying to create things. So what role do you envisage? Is there a constructive role it can play?
And I think let's address this question in its widest context, not, I mean, no, out of the microfinance box.
So, I think there is a section on government that I've talked about where the whole idea of the current nation state and countries being the locus of government is something that we need to challenge because it's too far away, it's too distant. Whoever, I mean, even if you put Superman there instead of an Obama or instead of a Modi, you're not going to change the fundamental because they're just too far away. And these things are too large, too complex for any set of individuals to make some real impact on. There can be superficial impact, there'll be obviously improvements, but you can't make fundamental change. So I think we have to get back to the Gandhian notion of a self-government where citizens are engaged, whether you call it panchayat, whether it's a council within a locality where you have a few 10,000 people, a few families who get actively engaged. This is not a problem you can outsource. Today we have outsourced all our government problems to some set of politicians and administrators. We have to take our responsibility there. And so it has to go up right up to a world government level. That you cannot manage a set of 189 countries in the world as if they were running different ships. Unfortunately, we are on a single ship, which is one planet. And we can't, through negotiation, come to a conclusion. We need a mechanism by which we actually cede power to a larger authority to decide some critical issues. Obviously, not every aspect of our life, but whatever is subsidiary at that point has to be driven at that level.
Yeah, Akshay?
So I just want to chip in and talk about government there, and again, not to really differ from Sudhakar, but to really talk about paradigms. I mean, a utopian one government for the whole world is a great situation. But again, how possible is that, and how do we therefore work within governments today and try and leverage the collective power that is coming out of personal power to be able to make governments look at it? And I want to talk specifically to the 2% CSR so-called incentive that is built into government. Is that really going to work to be able to create a paradigm? I don't think so. I don't think that by forcing someone to put their 2% CSR. So government needs to be bottom up to see what's needed to be able to create this ecosystem and not sort of dangle carrots and put sticks, which is going to completely warp the incentive model. So,
Please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Akshay, and I have a question for Sudhakar. It's a very inspiring book, obviously, and your effort. But my question is this. If you go for crowdsourcing, then we should be ready to accept the results. And I have two examples to give where it may not work. One is at a village level and one is at an international level. At a village level, a lot of NGOs, including my own, when we went in with about 50,000 rupees and asked the villagers what they wanted, instead of development, they asked for a temple. At an international level in Palestine, they have elected, the majority has elected Hamas, which in many ways could be a terrorist organization. So there's it's a very tricky thing to say to empower the locals and this we have tried it in many different, there's autonomous councils in India and Darjeeling and in the Northeast, which have not worked because you empowered the locals. So what is your comment on that if you've studied that at all?
So I'll push back on this, Akshay, which is, who are you to empower them?
No, I think, Sudhakar, that's not being fair.
It is.
Okay, let me illustrate it with another example. And in fact, that's what led to my book on bazaars, that by the late 90s, the activist groups across India were militating for one demand, that the Jal Jangal Jameen, forest, land and water, should be in the control of the local community. But we saw in some cases, in many cases, that there is a segment of the local community that grabs the power and makes a deal which compromises the resource, natural resource base of the community. Now, whether that is corruption or whether it is a power play, so that is one problem. Or, for example, the more stark issue comes up in the context of the Khap Panchayats, where, it's true, that's exactly what the Khap Panchayat says. Who are you to tell me what is women's rights or child rights? But the point is that are we not also empowered as just as human beings to say to the Khap Panchayat, or for example to the ISIS that apparently has today issued a horrendous call on what they want to do to women in their territories, that is there not some kind of overarching humanness or humanity or humanitarian fundamentals with which we can say, who are you to dictate this? And how do we resolve these kind of standoffs?
See, that's actually the fallacy here, Rajni, which is you don't want a Khap Panchayat to dictate, but we think we have the right to dictate to them. You have to solve it at the fundamental level, which is that any of these, I mean, there will be corruption, there will be power bases which take charge, but you allow the local system to overcome that. Because that's a natural evolutionary process, rather than coming and interfering saying, I'll solve the problem. So, I always have a right to have a point of view. Like, I may have a point of view about Bush saying he shouldn't have gone to war, but do I really do anything more than voice that opinion? We can't do that. No, we leave it their sovereign, we leave it to them to take their own decisions. Like that, every individual is sovereign. We have to leave it to them to make their decisions. I can't assume that I know better than them. What works there, and things will change. We have to allow things to happen rather than thinking that we have to solve every problem which goes around.
No, but allowing things to happen requires some kind of framework, doesn't it? See, because if we had gone, I'm just provoking you that by that logic, feudalism may never have ended. We could still have the divine right to rule with complete and totalitarian or rather authoritarian control of the, hereditary monarch. The point is that in culture after culture, in society after society, many of those things were questioned, they were challenged, and eventually they were overthrown. Now that takes sustained, first of all, literally creating of a narrative, creating of an aspiration, and then militating for it.
Exactly, but it was all done within that system.
Well,
it was not someone from outside who came and said, I'll throw a monarch out or I'll throw an emperor out.
Well, France was outside for the US, for the fledgling American states, and yet liberty, fraternity saw itself go into action first in the US. And in that sense, Sudhakar, today you are saying connected age. So today, more than ever before, the geographical location of where an idea is born has become utterly and completely irrelevant.
So that's actually, I think that the ecosystem actually is already there where people are connected. So it's not that I can assume that somebody taking power, whether it's a Khap Panchayat or whether it is a local tribal leader, that can sustain, because people are far more aware. They know that they have rights, they know that they have a ability, and they have case studies, they have examples from other parts of the world which will inspire them. But finally, the way they will act on it will be very different from the way someone else will act on it.
Of course.
But what about people who don't know they have rights, and people who are being independently suppressed, intentionally suppressed? So, how do we create, that movement?
So that's, when I talk about optimal governance, that's exactly that where we know that there is a lack of a level playing field, where every individual doesn't perceive his own sovereignty, we need some intervention, but it has to be time bound. It has to be clear that the only thing is to ensure that they recognize their own power, nothing more than that. We can't go and give solutions to them because the solutions are foreign.
Yeah. I think the essence of what you're saying, Sudhakar, seems to be that let us not be judgmental. Let us not stand outside and in judgment of people who are inside an ecosystem that we may not fully understand. That thing, there would be no dispute on that. Is there another question? Because otherwise I'm at risk of going on.
Lots of hands up.
Yeah? Would you like to?
Yeah. Hi, good evening. I'm Bela. Just wanted to go step back a little and sort of say, how do we create this fabric of culture that we're saying? So we have connectedness.
Are you able to hear the question? Is everyone able?
Can you maybe hold it a little closer to you?
Yeah. This fabric of connectedness, we all have it. So is it a change or reinforcement of the education system that we need to sort of look at? So that's a question. So I'm raising it from a different angle, not from a business angle, but how do we sort of create that fabric of culture? Yeah.
And in fact, there's a huge role that social media is potentially playing in this.
Yeah.
Because there are new forms of connectivity cropping up, which are maybe just the old bottle in the old wine in new bottles, but maybe they are creating new kinds of wine also. But would you, either of you, like to tackle
Bela, my
that?
perspective here is, we have assumed again that a child cannot be sovereign, that we have to put them through something which will, at the end, so we know Howard Gardner study that you take 98% population who are at genius level, and finally it becomes 2% at genius and 98% who are dumb. That's what all our schooling system does to people. So how do we actually recognize that as a child I have just as much right and focus on learning rather than on education? Because education is what you do to someone, learning is what somebody does for themselves. So can we create encounters, can we create situations where kids can learn, and they'll probably learn very different from what we think they should learn. So, I mean, the most advanced system I saw way back, in the First World War was Maria Montessori. She thought of this, she recognized the sovereignty of a child and created a system, and I've not seen anyone given that level of thought to how. Obviously the tools are outdated, we need to upgrade it, but literacy, research in the area of primary education is abysmal today. Anywhere in the world, nobody's focusing, but that's the most fertile, most creative time of a child's life, where we have to put the maximum effort to create that learning opportunity for children.
I'd just like to comment on that, in as much as you said, how do we create this fabric? And I'm thinking we don't. In fact, we need to stop uncreating the wrong fabric, because every child that is born with a connectedness fabric already. The very fact that the process of birth has an umbilical cord is part, I think, and for me, symbolic of that connectedness already that mankind is born into. And most of our misaligned incentives from birth onward tend to start undoing that fabric rather than creating it. And so, the process I think Sudhakar mentioned is spot on, that let's just make sure that the child continues to grow in that genius realm.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah?
There's a hand over there. And Shailesh, wherever the mic is closer. Coming to you, Shailesh.
Thank you. Is that on? Yeah? Okay, good evening. I'm Rashika Singh from the World Bank, the IFC group, and I came actually a little bit late, so I apologize if you've covered this in the discussion, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, a little bit building on Rajni's comment about social media, but your thoughts on the role of technology in this. We look at rural mobile penetration, the merits and the demerits of it. We've touched upon private-public roles in it, but I'd be interested to hear from your experiences as well.
So obviously, one of the reasons why we have the ability to be connected is technology, but it's also the reason why we are completely disconnected. We can't even sit in a meeting without just referring our Blackberries or smartphones or Apple or whatever. But that's, any tool can be misused by the human being. We have that unique ability that we can do anything with it. So, technology is vital, and it's not just internet, which is at the information level. I think if we really pursue small is beautiful, you're looking at deep economies, local economies, then technologies like 3D printing are going to be very, very important going forward, because it completely obviates the need for scale and things being done in a factory. I can have my neighbor 3D printer printing my stuff for me. And those kind of technologies, I think, are bringing manufacturing, bringing the whole process of producing goods much closer to the neighborhood.
I'd like to give 3 quick examples, one in Uganda, one in Kenya, and then one closer home. the Grameen Community Knowledge Worker Program, the Grameen Health Worker Program, and then our own Grameen Capital crowdfunding platform. There is a technology, I mean a simple phone where a farmer in a village in Kenya can take a picture of his crop. It goes to a research institute and tells him what's the malady on that, what's the parasite, what's causing that issue. He immediately gets an SMS back saying this is what you need to put to treat that plant, and his crop survives. Simple interventions that need no rocket science in that sense, or but can be done. The Health Worker Program is a program for maternal health. It goes to pregnant women. It tells them this is week 1, this is week 31, this is week 22, this is what you need to expect, this is what you should feel, this is what you should eat, this is what you should drink, this is how much you should rest. And if this is not happening to you today or this week, let your nearest healthcare professional talk to you. So every week there is, and so we're now replicating that in Bihar and Eastern UP through some corporate partners to be able to do that. And again, crowdfunding we see as a big tool whereby people like Kiva, who've done successfully globally, to be able to find social enterprises scattered all over the world, and people who would like to support these, to bring them together and really catalyze that growth. So,
I just want to add that the Promethean dilemma is never going to go away. No, the Greek character who stole fire from the gods and was punished for it, because ever since we learned how to make fire, we have had this problem or this dilemma that we can use it to cook meals and we can use it to burn down the neighbor's house. And that is never going to go away. And so the same social media, which is enabling us to do some amazing and unprecedented good, has also unleashed the intolerant in all of us. And it's not just in India. Across the world, there are reports of the dramatic escalation of hate mail, of completely vicious responses to simple ideas, etc. So again, it comes back to the basic challenge that unless there is a vibrant social process of, and I think you outlined that very well, where each one of us is engaged in doing the right thing, and I don't mean right in some judgmental sense here, it's going to be, it's up for grabs. I think the jury will remain out on this indefinitely, which way it will tilt more to the good or more to the dark.
Isn't right always in judgmental sense?
Sorry?
How can you be right in a non-judgmental sense?
Well, in the sense that there are certain judgments on which there is universal agreement. Say, for example, the right to life.
Is there?
Well, of course, there are always violations.
I'm serious. I mean, I really one wonders, because the paradigms are shifting so quickly that you can't be saying you're right in a non-judgmental sense. And I think we should stop being shy of being judgmental if we want to be judgmental and call a spade a spade.
No, of course that is true. I simply was going back to Sudhakar's point that there is an inside and an outside of many of these things. And it is a big challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, because as you're saying, many of the fundamentals are up for grabs sometimes, as they are now currently in the Middle East very much, or very, the very basic norms of civil behavior are violated on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't change the norm. What we would in a broad sense consider civil behavior, its details will always be up for dispute. But for example, the incident the other day at the Maharashtra Southern in Delhi, there can be all kinds of, because what came first, what came later, but the basic sequence of actions would not pass most definitions of civil behavior. So there is some fundamental territory, and then there is a huge area of subjective judgment.
So my view on this, Royston, is that there is no universal right. It's only what's right for you at that point. At the moment, you do whatever you think is right, and it may keep shifting as you learn, as you evolve. I cannot force my point of view on someone else. Everybody has the right to do whatever they think is right. Like to paraphrase Voltaire, what he said is, I completely disagree with you, but I'll defend unto death your right to say what you said. So it's like that. Everybody has that right, and they will go through their own learning journeys. All I can take care is what I think is right, and am I in integrity with myself, nothing more.
Hi, my question is for Royston. Royston, Grameen itself as an organization is outside the mainstream financial ecosystem. You know, you've come up as a new entity and you're outside any mainstream bank. And so you've been able to do what you've been doing. But what's very interesting in the example you mentioned is you're cross-collaborating now with mainstream partners like Danone, who's a mainstream food supplier, for an unconventional solution. I don't know if it's sustainable or not, but at least it's one step towards something good. I'd like to know if a mainstream company like Danone is using this experiment to change the way they're doing business as a whole, instead of just, or are they just relegating it to CSR again? Are they looking at sustainable food chains? I mean, it's fun to bring this beautiful product, and I'm saying it's a good act, but are they looking at how it could be manufactured locally or with local ingredients? Or is it just, again, one nice thing to do?
No, that's a great question. And, you know, interestingly, in Bangladesh, it is across the food chain. So the women who get loans from Grameen Bank to buy the cow or the goat or the buffalo are the ones producing the milk that is going into the, you know, Grameen Shakti, which is getting fortified by Grameen BASF, which is the chemical social business with Grameen BASF. So it's interesting how Professor Yunus is playing out the whole, you know, end-to-end of the food chain. Is it globally sustainable that organizations are going to continue to build social businesses? One doesn't know, but again, to Sudhakar's point, the connected ager may be able to see these type of paradigms emerge, but fairly certain to say it's not just a pilot anymore, at least in that level. And again, what we are building in India, again, if we are able to build a whole capital with a conscience ecosystem, then why will someone plug into an investment banker that is going to charge him X% of fee if he's a social enterprise, when he knows that there is a whole ecosystem here, that if he has an idea as a 20-year-old college student to be able to provide rural, social, off-grid power to a village in India that is non-electrified, that he can get the seed capital, then he can get the debt, then he can get the equity, then he can find a social stock exchange and really build a scaled model on the back of something like this. We don't know. The jury is out, but there are some very, very bright lights to give us hope.
Shailesh?
Shailesh Gandhi here. I would like to agree with what Sudhakar has been talking of the sovereignty of the individual, and I think a lot of us in our talk, we talk about it at one level but we don't really believe it. For example, Rajni said, if you agree with that, will you agree with the Khap Panchayat? And a similar thought is there in lots of our minds. I think that's where government comes in. Government lays down the law. Those of us, we may be individual sovereigns, but we do not overstep that law. If we believe a law is bad, we work towards changing it. But if you break the law, I think there is a problem, and I would look at the Maharashtra Southern incident also from that prism and say what they were doing was breaking the law, and therefore it is wrong. It's not your moral judgment versus mine. We can certainly argue about it, and that's the small point I wanted to bring in.
I completely agree, Shailesh.
But I'm sorry, Shailesh, you can't give up on that. I want to just introduce Shailesh Gandhi is a businessman turned right to information activist. He served on the National Right to Information Commission as a commissioner. I think you should say a little bit more, Shailesh, about how you're struggling or what you see, since you're so close to the ground through the Right to Information movement. Can you tell us something about the ways in which people are asserting in a both creative or uncreative way, this individual sovereignty in a sense, with a sense of larger responsibility?
No, I think right to information I am in love with because it exercises this sovereignty of the individual citizen, for which we had no way before. Earlier we talked of it, but there was really no way. This is practically converting it, and every individual citizen sitting in our own house exercises that sovereignty. But otherwise it'd be much longer, Rajni, some of the time.
There was another hand somewhere here.
Yeah. Sudhakar, this is Siddharth. So this question is for you. You spoke of this new narrative from independence to interdependence. And one thing that I'm seeing, and I would love your thoughts on this, is that all of us are so conditioned by this industrial revolution, this education we've been brought up in. It seems like all the paradigms we keep coming up with are still from the old school. So what is your experience with this? You know, how do you operate in a paradigm like this when all that we keep coming up with is, you know, all independence rooted?
So actually it requires a level of reflection, pause and self-awareness. There's no other, because your natural autopilot response is what we have been conditioned to as we grow up, and it will be an industrial age response. So at every point, what I do as a personal thing is step back and see, is this a conditioned response? Is this who I really am? And who we really are interdependent. I think that was a conversation we had, that man is a social animal, and there is a natural feeling of community. We would like to relate to people. We would like to help one another out. That's very natural in human beings. What we are conditioned to do from day one, and we cause it, our parents have caused it. I mean, you start creating boundaries, saying, oh, if you go out, a stranger may hurt you. So you start thinking other people are bad, I am good. You start creating a system where my immediate locality is safe, everything else is unsafe. So we create fears, and human beings have the ability to operate out of fear or operate out of courage. All our conditioning operates on our fears, and it keeps building up a baggage in our heads where I'm all for myself, it's a dog-eat-dog world, it's all competitive, if I don't look after myself, who's going to look after me? All these thoughts keep coming in the head. So it's consciously releasing those and saying, no, the world is a very kind place, and I'll accept, and I'll have the faith that I can survive, regardless of, letting go of my defenses.
Of course, Siddharth, this is an old phenomenon, right? What you've just described is actually very, very ancient. In the Mahabharata, Dronacharya sends both Yudhishthir and Duryodhan to go and seek and count how many good and bad people there are in that town. And Yudhishthir comes back saying he couldn't find a single bad person. Duryodhan comes back saying he can't find a single good person. So this phenomenon of people's different propensities and being determined not so much by what is actually out there, but by what are the lens of the individual. And our traditional texts indicate that to some extent we are born hardwired. There is some such thing as an innate propensity. The question is that whatever social context we are in expands or contracts this spectrum, you know, from ultraviolet to infrared, where at one end you have Buddha and Gandhi, and at the other end you have Pol Pot and Hitler and company. But I think I would really like you to share a little bit about what your network does, which is very related to, in fact, the person who just asked the question, Siddharth Stalekar, is a living manifestation of Sudhakar's claims about the connected age. He's part of a network that has that's called Moved by Love. So just 2 minutes, Siddharth. Please tell us a little bit about it. Here's the mic.
Mike was moved by love to you.
Now I feel like I have my sovereignty back. I can go on speaking. But I think as part of this network, and as part of my journey over the last few years, so to give you my background, I've been part of capital markets on the trading floor in Bombay for very long, which is at one end of the spectrum. And there the basic assumption is man is rooted in consumption and requires external things for his happiness. But I think as part of this network, through Moved by Love, through various other experiments, we've shifted our assumption to saying, what if we assume that man actually thrives in interdependence? And if that is our assumption, what manifestations appear? And I think one of our biggest challenges is that whatever manifestation we try to come up with always kept going back to the old school. So I think now the way we're looking at it is how can we have one foot in the unknown and say we need to co-create this new manifestation of interdependence. And I think just to approach it with saying, I don't know what that future looks like, but I have some amount of faith that it will emerge. And I think that's very exciting, because when we all collectively approach the situation with a big I don't know, it's very rattling for us because we're not used to it, but that's a lot of what our experiments have been rooted in. And even for me, I think as coming back to banking, coming back to finance, with these kind of assumptions, what would it look like is a question that I hold right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think there's another question there, and then another one here, and another one there. We'll be very brief now because we are very close to closing time. So if everybody could be brief, and we'll try to keep the answers brief. Yeah, please go ahead. Who has the mic? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I'm not able to...
Go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Royston. I want to know about your views about commodified speciality. So many flats in South Bombay are lying vacant because they're investor flats or owned by corporates, whereas so many people are living on the streets or in extremely poor conditions. And given that capitalism is increasing on such an extent, this concept of commodified speciality is increasing. What are your views on this?
I don't know. I'll take recourse in that. No, but I genuinely don't know, but I'm thinking about her answer about government, her question rather about government, and saying, is there a role that government can play to be able to unlock some of these properties by giving comfort to the owners that the property is never going to go away, but rather than being vacant and unused, is there a way that there's an incentive that government can give you a tax waiver for the next 5 years if you open your house and commit that if people do not vacate in a certain period of time till alternate accommodation is made? I'm thinking on the spot, but there must be some ways creatively to find solutions to social problems. I think that's what Professor Yunus has ingrained in us. Every single social problem can find a solution that makes sense even to the one-dimensional individual. Sudhakar's point is, how do we move from being one-dimensional into multi-dimensional like we were meant to be? But even to the one-dimensional individual, can we create a solution in an interim manner that provides these people? So possibly there is something hidden there.
No, I have a counter view there, which is that every problem doesn't need to be solved.
Or cannot be solved.
Doesn't need to be solved.
Okay. Ma'am.
My name is Lakshmi Dhol, and I just have one thing. Maybe it's going to open a completely new passage of thought.
Could you put the mic a little closer, please?
Our latest narrative in today's world is terrorism. And I think it's dissatisfaction and discontent that is spreading because we are connected. A horrible story I heard, I think it was the Commissioner of Police of Maharashtra was talking, and he said that one terrorist goes to a prison where they are all petty thieves and car thieves, whatever. And by the time he comes out, or he doesn't come out, within a short amount of time, all of them become terrorists. So I think, the social fiber and our connectedness is a big problem here, because we are not connecting to things that aspire higher thoughts within us.
True. So I'm not saying connected age is all positive. There'll obviously be negatives of connection also. But if there's enough positive momentum, then we should find ways of neutering or even countering the negatives which arise.
But terrorism is something which is going, is spreading wider and wider.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a huge problem for tomorrow.
But see, it's all actually coming down to the fact that there is total inequity, right? At the base of it, whether it is at a geopolitical level or at an individual economic level, the level of inequality is so high that some natural human reaction is that. I don't condone terrorism, but I can see why it's happening, and we may need a more fundamental answer than to look at terrorism as a symptom of something else. We can either try and address the symptom, or we can look at what's the root cause.
And then but then again, that's a problem which you're trying to find the symptom for to address it. So in some ways, the fact that Grameen won the Nobel Peace Prize and not the Economics Prize was again a big debate for a long time, saying, it's a bank, why would someone who started a bank and giving loans get a Nobel Peace Prize? But the Nobel Committee in their citation said very clearly that the point he made about inequality is creating most of the social ills of our time, and if we are able to create a solution that's empowering people to be able to stand on their own feet and get higher self-esteem and respect and being able to then come up in terms of the quality of life that they have, it decreases the propensity of them to get into activities that would malign that, and so in some ways possibly even counter terrorism by reducing that inequality.
One last question. We have time for one last. Yes, please.
My name is also Sudhakar. I run a group of non-government organization. Sudhakar, your Connected the World is excellent title, but right under our nose is disconnect. I'll give you two examples. One is that in India today, a day 300 women who are delivering the baby, they die because there is no connect of health sector. That's number one. Number two is that Orissa tribals had to dance to get themselves liberated with the industrialists digging their god, the mountain, which was bauxite. Thing. Government said, because we were talking about CAP, government said, okay, you decide what you want.
I'm sorry, can you please keep your question brief, because we've actually crossed our time limit.
This is, how do you respond to that, Sudhakar? Similarly, Mr. Braganza, there is a gentleman like the Eunice who developed fishing in every household. He went from India, Mr. Agarwal, if you know. So he also talked about the micronutrient and the health, and it is in a revolution in Bangladesh. But he has no time for India. How do you respond?
So, see, the entire thesis of the connected age is a vision for the future. I'm not saying we are already connected. If we were, then we won't have all the problems. So, my vision for the future, and what I urge every individual to have as their own vision for the future is, what kind of a world would they like to leave behind for their grandchildren? So clearly what you're saying are issues of an unconnected world, and that's why we need a connected world. So
I'd like to end with a slide that I made, which someone sent me on Facebook this morning, which I didn't know when to use. So thank you, Sudhakar, for your question. Yeah. Yeah, Yunus doesn't have the time for India. That's why I'm here. And so are you.
What does it say? Can you just read it out?
very nice.
I think, no, I can't read it.
It says, sometimes I want to ask God why he allows poverty, famine, and injustice in the world when he could do something about it. But I'm afraid he might ask me the same question back.
Indeed. I think on that note, we'll close for the evening with a big thanks to Avid. And a small, in the same spirit of what you just said, Royston, we all know about the Trojan horse, which was the end of a very, very long battle. And many of the problems that we have, including all of those, are sometimes they feel like citadels that have to be stormed. And an American writer who I respect very greatly, Marilyn Ferguson, she did a survey in the 70s, which actually was a precursor, Sudhakar. So she has found from the 70s onwards that there are people who are finding, she was studying mind and neurosciences, and she was a science reporter, so it was really based on very detailed research, that there are people who find that they have an experience that changes what their perspective of the world is, and it empowers them to do things differently and to become, in a sense, energized to address a lot of that. And then they feel that if this has happened to me, it can happen to other people also, and it must be happening to other people. And I think that process is actually continuing. It's a steady onward process. And maybe the crux of it is what Marilyn Ferguson herself said much later, about 5-6 years ago. She said, we now live in the age not of the Trojan horse, but of the Trojan heart. We all have to find ways to put our heart and our empathy inside the citadel to be able to see the problem from inside out, not the other way around. Thank you so much. Thank you, Royston. Thank you, Sudhakar.